There are sons who grow up in the shadow of greatness. And then there is Julian Lennon, a man who grew up in the shadow of a legend, only to watch that legend choose someone else over him, again and again. John Lennon sang about peace, preached about love, and became one of the most celebrated human beings the 20th century ever produced. But at home, behind closed doors, his firstborn son was quietly learning a different lesson that the man who told the world to imagine a better place couldn't quite manage to imagine being a present father. And then there was Yoko Ono. For decades, Julian Lennon's feelings toward his stepmother have been one of the music world's most quietly devastating open secrets. He never screamed it from rooftops. He didn't write a bitter tell-all book or give explosive tabloid interviews designed to destroy reputations. Instead, he said what he said carefully, thoughtfully, and with the kind of controlled pain that only comes from someone who has spent years learning how to hold grief without letting it swallow him whole. What he said in various forms and across various interviews amounted to something close to despising the woman who entered his father's life and, in Julian's view, took everything his father's attention, his father's estate, and the years they might have used to finally become close. This is the story of Julian Lennon, not the tabloid version, not the version where he is simply John Lennon's son. This is the story of a man shaped by absence, inheritance, legal battles, heartbreak, and an achingly slow journey towards something that might, on the best of days, be called peace. Julian Charles John Lennon entered the world at Sefton General Hospital in Liverpool, England. His arrival was complicated before it even began. John Lennon, already ascending toward global fame as a Beatle, had married Julian's mother Cynthia Powell, a marriage that was kept secret from the public because the Beatles' management team feared that the image of John as an eligible, unattached young man was essential to the band's commercial appeal. Cynthia, pregnant and quietly in love, found herself hidden from the very world that was falling at her husband's feet. John and Cynthia had met years earlier at the Liverpool College of Art, and Cynthia was already engaged to someone else at the time, and John Lennon was exactly the kind of magnetic, unpredictable, and occasionally cruel young man that she hadn't planned on falling for. He pursued her anyway. When she initially rejected his advances, John reportedly snapped back that he hadn't asked her to marry him, a comment that was somehow both off-putting and irresistible. They began a relationship, and for a time, it was passionate and real. But John Lennon was already becoming something larger than an ordinary man could contain. Fame has a way of consuming people, and it consumed John in ways that had devastating consequences for everyone close to him. Cynthia later reflected that the John she had fallen in love with slowly disappeared into the machinery of Beatlemania, into the experimental fog of LSD, and eventually into the arms of another woman entirely. Julian grew up aware of all of this, not immediately, not as a young child, but gradually, the way children always eventually understand the architecture of their parents' unhappiness. And what he understood, as the years went on, was that he had been born into a story where he was never quite the main character in his own father's life. If there is one moment that crystallized the rupture of Julian Lennon's early childhood, it happened in May, when Cynthia returned home from a holiday to find Yoko Ono sitting in her kitchen, wearing her bathrobe, drinking tea as though she owned the place. John looked up and offered the kind of greeting that could only be described as aggressively casual. "Oh, hi." 2 words. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what was being destroyed in that moment. Cynthia left the house. Julian was 5 years old. The divorce that followed was handled with about as much grace as everything else in John Lennon's personal life, which is to say, not very much. John initially threatened to seek custody of Julian on the grounds of Cynthia's alleged infidelity with a man named Alexis Mardas, a friend of the Beatles known as Magic Alex. The claim was widely regarded as a manipulation tactic, a way for John to control the narrative of the split. Eventually, John allowed Cynthia to file for divorce, and the settlement she received was, by any reasonable measure, meager given the wealth involved: a lump sum, a modest annual payment, and custody of their son. Julian stayed with his mother, and John went on to build a whole new life, one that, for a very long time, had very little room in it for the boy he had left behind. This is not an easy thing to write about, and it is not an easy thing to have lived. Julian has spoken about this period with a kind of measured sadness that speaks to years of processing. He has acknowledged that his mother bore the weight of raising him largely alone, while his father became one of the most famous people on earth. The disproportion of that situation, the iconic public father, and the quietly suffering private family, is something Julian has never fully been able to set aside. And Yoko Ono, whether fairly or not, became in Julian's mind a symbol of everything that went wrong. It would be too simple to say that Julian Lennon hates Yoko Ono because she broke up his parents' marriage. Adults understand that marriages are rarely destroyed by a single person's arrival. They break down through accumulated disappointment, incompatibility, and choices that each partner makes over time. Julian, as a thoughtful and reflective man, has acknowledged this complexity. But understanding something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two very different things. And what Julian felt, for a very long time, was that Yoko Ono was the woman who took his father away and then, when his father died, took everything else too. When John Lennon was shot and killed outside the Dakota Building in New York City on the night of Julian was 17 years old. He heard about his father's death from a reporter before anyone in John's inner circle had thought to call him directly. That detail alone, the fact that a journalist broke the news rather than a family member, tells you something devastating about where Julian stood in the hierarchy of John Lennon's world. John's will, when it was read, left his entire estate to Yoko Ono. Julian received nothing directly, not a symbolic gesture, not a keepsake specifically designated for the son he had largely left behind. The estate, valued at the time at roughly $220 million, went entirely to Yoko, who then also controlled the ongoing royalties from John's music royalties that continued to grow enormously in the years and decades following his death. For Julian, this wasn't simply a financial wound, though the financial dimension was real and significant. It was an emotional verdict. It felt like his father, even in death, had confirmed the ranking that his second family mattered more than his first. That Yoko and Sean, John's son with Yoko born, were the real family, and Julian was the outlier. Julian Lennon did not quietly accept what he had been given, which is to say, almost nothing. In the years following John's death, he pursued legal action against his father's estate, seeking what he believed was his rightful share of John Lennon's legacy. The legal battle stretched across 16 years, an exhausting and emotionally costly process that required Julian to publicly assert his own worth in a situation where he had spent much of his life feeling overlooked. The settlement he eventually received in the mid was rumored to be approximately $20 million. It was, by any ordinary standard, a substantial sum of money. But the number itself was almost beside the point. What the legal battle represented was Julian's refusal to simply disappear, his insistence that he existed, that he mattered, that he was owed acknowledgement, even if the acknowledgement came through a courtroom rather than a conversation. During this period, Julian's feelings toward Yoko Ono were, by his own description, complicated and at times deeply bitter. He felt that Yoko had controlled access to his father's memory and legacy in ways that excluded him. He felt that she had not encouraged John to be more present in Julian's life during the years when John was alive and reconnection was still possible. And he felt, and this is the part that carried the sharpest edge, that she had benefited enormously from a man whose first family had been largely discarded. Julian has never called Yoko evil. He has never accused her of malicious intent in the way that tabloid narratives sometimes require. What he has done is something more honest and more painful. He has described the reality of what it felt like to be John Lennon's forgotten son, while Yoko Ono managed the story of John Lennon's life. That feeling had a name, and for a long time, the name was close to despising. To understand Julian's complicated grief, you have to understand that his feelings toward his father were never simple either. John Lennon was not a straightforward villain in Julian's life story. He was something far more difficult, a man of undeniable brilliance and warmth who simply could not, or would not, show up consistently for the people who needed him most. Julian has spoken about the rare good periods with enormous warmth. In the mid-dash, during the years when John was involved with May Pang, a relationship that Yoko had, extraordinarily, encouraged, John reconnected with Julian in ways that hadn't happened before. They laughed together. They played music. John bought Julian a Gibson Les Paul guitar and a drum kit one Christmas, teaching him chords and sparking a musical passion that would define Julian's life. These were the moments Julian treasured, proof that the warmth he had always wanted from his father was real, that it existed somewhere beneath the distance and the dysfunction. But those years with May Pang ended, and John returned to Yoko, and the distance returned with him. Julian has described this pattern with a kind of resigned sadness, the way good periods would briefly appear and then be withdrawn, leaving him always slightly off balance, never quite certain how to understand the man his father was. When John was killed, Julian lost not just his father, but the possibility of the relationship they might eventually have built. John had reportedly expressed a desire, in the final years of his life, to reconnect with Julian to repair what had been broken. Julian has spoken about this with grief, noting that his father seemed to have been moving toward a better place in the months before his death. The murder ended all of that. Whatever reconciliation might have been possible became instead a wound that could never properly heal, because it had never properly begun. While John Lennon was telling the world to imagine peace and declaring his love for all of humanity, Julian was growing up in Hoylake and later in North Wales with his mother Cynthia, navigating school, adolescence, and the particular strangeness of being the famous man's hidden son. He attended Ruthin School, a private boarding school in Denbighshire, where he was largely away from both his father's immediate influence and the constant noise of his father's global fame. Paul McCartney, remarkably, was a more consistent presence during some of these years than John himself. When John left Cynthia, Paul McCartney reportedly drove from London to Hoylake to visit Cynthia and Julian, clearly troubled by what his bandmate had done and wanting to offer something: presence, kindness, the acknowledgement that they mattered. It was Paul who wrote Hey Jude, originally titled Hey Jules, as a song of comfort for the 5-year-old boy whose world had just been turned upside down. Julian has said that he and Paul spent more time together during certain periods of his childhood than he ever spent with his own father, and that photographs bear this out. More images exist of Paul McCartney playing with young Julian than of John doing the same. Julian has reflected on this with something that sounds like wistfulness rather than bitterness toward Paul. He genuinely valued the connection, but it also threw his father's absence into sharp relief, because Paul's presence was proof that someone could choose to show up, and his father had largely chosen not to. The emotional legacy of this childhood was significant. Julian has spoken honestly about recognizing his father's darker tendencies within himself, a capacity for anger, for aggression, and consciously working to manage those tendencies, to become something different from the man who couldn't show up for him. He made a decision, somewhere along the way, that he would not simply repeat the pattern. As he grew older, he declined to have children of his own, at least partly out of fear that he didn't yet know himself well enough to be the kind of father he would want to be. Julian Lennon's music career has always existed in a complicated space built on genuine talent, haunted by constant comparison to his father, and representing, in ways that go beyond the commercial, a form of survival and self-expression that kept him functional through some very difficult years. His debut album, Velat, released and was an instant commercial success. The title track and Too Late for Goodbyes both became significant hits, and Julian earned a Grammy nomination for Best New Artist. Critics noted, uncomfortably but inevitably, how much his voice resembled his father's. The comparison was both a commercial asset and a personal burden, a reminder that even in his artistic achievements, Julian could not fully escape the shadow of John Lennon. His subsequent albums had mixed commercial fortunes, but Julian continued to make music not because the charts demanded it, but because he needed to. Saltwater, from his album Help Yourself, became one of his most significant recordings, an environmentally conscious song that demonstrated Julian's own values and concerns, distinct from his father's legacy. He released Lucy, a tribute to his childhood friend Lucy Vaughton, who had inspired his father's famous song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lucy had been diagnosed with lupus, and Julian donated 50% of the proceeds from the tribute song to lupus research. It was, among other things, an act of loyalty honoring a friendship that reached back to his earliest years. His album Jude, named deliberately after the song Paul McCartney wrote to comfort him, was described by Julian as a coming-of-age statement, a declaration of self-acceptance after decades of struggle. Calling the album Jude was, he said, very much about facing up to who he truly was. The album addressed both personal and global struggles with the kind of directness that comes from someone who has spent 30-plus years finding the courage to speak honestly. Julian Lennon spoke publicly about his journey toward forgiving his father. He described the experience of holding on to anger and resentment as living with a permanent cloud over his life, a weight that never lifted, that colored everything he did and felt. The process of making music, particularly the song Lucy, became for him a form of release, a way of completing a circle that had been left open for too long. He said that almost by nature, after recording the song, it felt right to forgive his father, to put the pain and the bitterness behind him and focus on the things that had been good. He described it as the first time he had felt truly capable of embracing both his father and the Beatles, not as a burden or a legacy to resist, but as something that was genuinely part of him. But forgiveness, as Julian has also been honest about, is not a single act. It is a practice, something you return to, something that requires effort not just once but repeatedly, especially when the old pain resurfaces. He has admitted that full forgiveness remained difficult even years after he first spoke about it. The wounds were simply too deep and too layered to be resolved through any single emotional breakthrough. His feelings toward Yoko Ono followed a similarly gradual and nonlinear trajectory. The shift, when it came, was largely attributed to his relationship with his half-brother Sean. Julian has made clear that he loves Sean Lennon genuinely and completely, that Sean is his brother in every meaningful sense, regardless of the complicated circumstances of their family's history. And it was this love for Sean that ultimately gave Julian a reason to let go of at least some of the bitterness toward Yoko. To despise Yoko fully, Julian reasoned, was to hurt Sean, and hurting Sean was something he was unwilling to do. The love for his brother became the path towards something approaching peace with his brother's mother. Julian Lennon today is a man who has built a life on his own terms as a musician, a photographer, a philanthropist through his White Feather Foundation, and as someone who has done the difficult internal work of understanding a childhood that would have broken many people.